All right. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rebecca Tamel, and I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Chapman Museum. And I'm thrilled that so many of you could join us tonight. We have a full virtual house, I should say. So that's wonderful. Before we get started, if you could just please mute your microphones, I would appreciate it. I'm going to be muting myself in just a bit once I get our introduction out of the way. And we do want to say that while tonight's program is free and we are thrilled that we are able to offer it for free, the cost of putting on programs is offset by memberships. So if you are interested in becoming a member at the Chapman Museum, please visit chapmanmuseum.org. You can look up at the top and there's a little green button that says support, and that's where you can become a member. So tonight we are going to hear from Patrick Stenshorn, who is the Education Program Manager at the Erie Canal National Heritage Corridor. He works with teachers and cultural organizations to develop K through 12 resources about New York State canals. Patrick has a BA in history from SUNY Geneseo and an MA in American History from SUNY Brockport. And he has previously held positions as an educator at the Women's Rights National Historical Park and at the Albany Institute of History and Art. Tonight's presentation by Patrick is going to look at the history of the Erie Canal, which this year is celebrating its 200th anniversary. So very exciting. And Patrick's talk is going to include discussion about 19th century industrial growth, population booms, social movements, and more, all thanks to the Erie Canal. If you do have any questions, I'm going to ask that you type them in the chat. And then once the presentation is over, I'll read them aloud and Patrick will be able to answer them. So now, if I will turn it over to Patrick and his presentation, the Grand Canal and the Rise of the Empire State.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for the invite to chat today. Sorry I couldn't be in person with you all tonight, but I'm glad that, with the technology, we're able to still be able to gather virtually. As Rebecca said, I am Patrick Stenshorn. I do work for Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor. And this year is really a big year across New York State, with it being the bicentennial of the Erie Canal, the 200th anniversary of the canal opening from end to end. We're, you know, we're doing a lot of these presentations across New York State where we kind of, dive into the bit of the history. Um, Obviously, with 200 years of history, I'm sure there are many history buffs and historians who are on the call today. With a 45-minute presentation over 200 years, you can only kind of scratch the surface. So what I hope to do with these presentations is to be able to kind of to bring context, to bring information, and to bring little bits of pieces that maybe are lesser known. So while some of what I will cover is more of the well-known impacts of the canal, the history of the canal, I do like to sort of infuse little pieces that I find a lot of people don't often know about, that bring in little stories. Uh, so first place where I always get started is really just the background, both in terms of when we're talking about what is sort of the New York State Canal System and what and who we are as an organization for Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor. The New York State Canal System today, and we'll talk a little bit about how the canal system has evolved over time, but today it's made up of four canals. The oldest is the one that is much closer to you. A lot of people don't realize that the Champlain Canal was the first of the New York State canals to actually open. It opened in 1823, running north and south from, at the time, Albany up to Whitehall, today from Waterford to Whitehall. The Erie opened second, fully opened second in 1825. Of course, they were opening sections of the canal as it was being built and constructed from 1817 to 1825. The third to open and is still in operation was the Cayuga-Seneca Canal, which is the canal that runs right here in the Finger Lakes, between Cayuga and Seneca Lakes, and connects up to the Erie Canal just north of Cayuga Lake. And then the final one to be constructed in 1828 was the Oswego Canal here. On this map that you see, uh, and again, we'll get a little bit more details. You see different alignments of the canal. So today, the dark blue lines are the currently operating canals. So you can see sort of where they operate today. And then the dotted lighter blue lines are the sort of historic alignments or where the canal once ran and no longer does. So the route that was used mostly during the 19th century, during the 1800s. The dark green around the canal system, that indicates the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor. So that is the organization that I work for, which is one of over 60 national heritage areas throughout the United States. The canal system itself is operated by the New York State Canal System, which is a subsidiary of the New York Power Authority. So it's a state-run agency. We, as the National Heritage Area, uh, have more of a public-private partnership, and we do a lot of work in sort of the educational space, recreation, tourism, heritage-based tourism, and less in sort of the waterway management, other than providing input about proposed operations. National heritage areas, if you're not familiar with them, they are affiliated with the National Park Service. There is a National Park Service program called the National Heritage Area Program. And what they are large landscapes that Congress deems to have some historical, cultural, or environmental, natural value to the nation, importance to the nation, but transferring ownership of that land for whatever reason would be too complicated and wouldn't make sense. So in this case, because we span over 500 miles of square miles throughout upstate New York, encompassing over 230 municipalities and a state-owned waterway managed system, it wouldn't make sense to transfer that to the federal system. So, in order to sort of designate the importance of the region, Congress designated the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor in 2000. So we are on our 25th anniversary as being an organization. The Erie Canal has gone through three separate phases, and I'm going to say this in sort of a kind of again a broad brushstroke. This can be broken down even more, but this is the way we generally talk about the three phases of the Erie Canal. If you are out or the canal system at large, if you are out, sort of traveling in different historic areas, you might come across these terms, and I always like to make sure that we define them. So that you know kind of what we're talking about. And if I use the terminology during this presentation, you know which version of the canal I am referring to. So there's the what's called the original, or sometimes it's called the Old Erie Canal. That is the canal system that opened in 1825. It was 4 feet deep and 40 feet wide. That's kind of the nostalgic, the canal that most people kind of when they think about packet boats traveling, horses and mules pulling those packet boats. That's kind of what most people think about, I think, in their sort of mind's eye. And that canal system, or that Erie Canal system, required 83 locks to transverse the elevation distance of about 600 feet from Albany, its eastern terminus on the Hudson River, to Buffalo on Lake Erie at its western terminus. Now, the canal system was pretty successful pretty early on. So within a decade of its operation, New York State decided that they needed to enlarge the canal system in order to allow for more boats and larger boats to go across the Erie Canal. So starting in 1834, and yes, it did take almost 30 years to complete the full enlargement for many different reasons, budgetary reasons, political reasons, economic reasons, and eventually a war that kind of interrupted those processes. from 1832 or 1834 to 1862, New York State widened and deepened the canal to 7 feet deep and 70 feet wide. And in doing so, also were able to reduce the number of locks on the Erie from 83 to 72, which is really important because when traveling the canal in the 19th century, where you really got held up the most was at a lock. So being able to knock off 11 locks because the technology had improved and you were able to enlarge the locks and handle greater elevation over a shorter distance was really important to people traveling and business who were operating on the canal system. And in this enlarged Erie Canal phase, that's really sort of the peak commercial use of the canal system. So the peak tonnage that's shipped on the canal happens in 1882. From 1882 towards 1900, commercial use kind of starts to dip. In 1899, when Teddy Roosevelt served his one term and essentially really 1 year as governor of New York State, he was looking for a way for the canal system to be competitive with railroads, which were siphoning off most of that business. And right sort of in that time period when the Panama Canal was being planned and then eventually built, that was what Teddy Roosevelt had in his head, was this idea of what would also become the Panama Canal as having this great large canal system that would basically allow for ocean liners to go right into New York Harbor and be able to get into the New York State Canal system and into the Great Lakes without having to stop and unload or portage or anything along those lines. So he commissioned the state legislator to create a report. The state legislator suggest or recommended the creation of what would become known as the New York State Barge Canal System in 1903, and construction began in 1905 and was completed in 1918. That canal system is what we have currently operational today. Depending on what section of the canal you're in, it's either 12 to 23 feet deep and 120 to 200 feet wide. And today's canal system uses canalized sections of natural rivers and lakes, which had not been able to be done previously due to the technology. And today, there's 57 total locks on the entire system, all four canals. There's only 35, 36 if you consider the federal lock out in the western section of the canal. So you see that obviously the technology, the size, it all got better. The reduction of the canal system locks, and by the barge canal time, boats are running either on steam or eventually on diesel power, and no longer are needing mules and horses to pull the barges and the boats at that point. So let's just kind of hop back a little bit about why the canal was needed, or why people in the early 1800s deemed a canal to be necessary. Now, discussions about a canal that would connect the eastern portion of the United States to the Great Lakes had really been in discussion all the way back to the mid 1700s. There had been proposals about this idea. Of course, there was this desire for people along the East Coast to move west, particularly in the period right after the American Revolution, that desire to get into what we would call the Old Northwest Territory, today's Midwest, which was seen as sort of this agricultural gold mine for growing grain and wheat. So people wanted to get there. And then once they got there, obviously what they wanted to do was to be able to send those products back. This map is actually from 1825. So this is what the United States looked like in 1825. I'm going to go back a couple times because I want to just point out on the map that you can see a dark line that's running right here across New York State, which is the Erie Canal. So by the time this map was actually created, the Erie Canal was constructed at this point. But what the largest impediment to all of this were mountains. There are certainly other challenges at this point in time, but largely the Appalachian mountain chain and up into the Adirondack Mountains as well are really what pose the largest challenge from from being able to get people to move west and to be able to get agricultural products and goods moving east to market. There really were no great breaks, especially no water route breaks through most of the Appalachian Mountains from about Georgia up until the Catskill Mountains. And that's really where the unique geography of New York State comes into play and why New York is the place where the Erie Canal happens. There were people prior to the Erie Canal who were trying to build canals that would go across the Appalachian Mountains. George Washington was very famously involved in several canal projects in Virginia that were trying to get a canal. He was trying to work on ways to get a canal up the Appalachian Mountains that would then eventually use gravity to pull the canal back down on the other side. Of course, that never happened. The cost and the labor in order to do such a thing in the late 1700s was insurmountable. So you really needed this natural, flat water break in the mountain chain in order to be able to get those products and those people to be able to move efficiently through the mountains. And that really just from a stroke of New York's geological luck comes in the form of the Mohawk River. That is the only all-water break in the Appalachian mountain chain that allows people to transverse and go through the mountains on a relatively flat piece of land. And that's what had been used for centuries as the best way to transport goods, sort of from the East Coast through and into the Great Lakes. This blue line that you see here, which kind of follows the route of the Mohawk River, and then eventually gets into Oneida Lake via this area that was known as the Oneida Carry into Oneida Lake, and then eventually into the Oswego River and Lake Ontario into Niagara, where it could portage around the falls and get into the Niagara River and eventually get into Lake Erie. That's the path that had been used for centuries by indigenous people, by the Haudenosaunee, by the Mohican people who are traveling this area, and then eventually by European colonists, the Dutch, the French, the English, who would settle in this region as well. And that is the path that had been used for centuries. But of course, it wasn't the easiest. It still was pretty arduous. The Mohawk River could be very difficult to travel on, especially with large loads. There was several different types of boats that they attempted to use to make it easier. And while this was the best path that they had in order to connect the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, it wasn't the route that they felt was best in order to do it. And so, again, people had proposed this idea. Again, very famously, Philip Schuyler, General Philip Schuyler, is one of the ones who, sort of in the late 17 and then early 1800s until his death, was proposing this idea, and he even formed two inland waterway navigation companies in order to pursue this idea of building a canal that would go across New York State that would basically run from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. And that would, in his estimation, greatly enhance the value of the land out in the western part of the state. It would greatly enhance the economic future of the United States to be able to move people and goods more efficiently across the state and connect all of those different pieces. And that is eventually what happens. This route that I chose here, it's not easy to draw that line using the pen feature on PowerPoint, but so it doesn't follow the exact route of the Erie Canal, but that's essentially the route that they were trying to do and that they would do in 1825. So let's get into some of the nuts and bolts about the Erie Canal. Like I said, discussions about this idea of connecting the Hudson River to the Great Lakes via a canal system date back into the mid 1700s. Cadwalader Colden has suggested this idea in the 1740s or 1750s, and it had been this idea that had percolated for quite some time, for about honestly 60 to 70 years. until a man by the name of Jesse Hawley, while sitting in debtor's prison, wrote, sort of this pamphlet that kind of described how this route would look. And he estimated costs, which essentially became very close to what the final costs were. And this was picked up by some notable New Yorkers, most notably DeWitt Clinton, um, Stephen Van Rensselaer, Gouverneur Morris sort of picked up this idea, and they became the first official like canal commissioners of New York State. They traveled out west to sort of map out the route in 1810, 1811. And then sort of the push to get funding through the New York State legislature occurred over the next 5 to 6 years. And eventually, in April 1817, the New York State legislature approved $7 million, which were largely funded by the sale of stocks and bonds to construct the Erie Canal. It took 8 years to complete. The Erie Canal, which ran from Albany along the Hudson River, 363 miles west to Buffalo at Lake Erie. It created that first all-water connection from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean and really did have the desired impact that people for decades had been arguing that it would. Who were the canal builders? This is one that a lot of people have a big interest in who the canal builders were, what the type of people were. The original Erie Canal that was completed in 1825. Many of the people who worked on the original building the original canal were native-born Americans. So that sort of idea of a lot of the Irish being involved, that is more of the enlarged Erie. The Irish come in a little bit more towards that period of the building of the Erie Canal. Now, the Irish were involved in the original Erie Canal, particularly along some of the more difficult areas. The Montezuma Marsh, sort of north of Cayuga and Seneca Lakes, is an area which was very difficult to complete, and Irish immigrants were involved very heavily in that section. And then what you see here, the excavation of the Niagara Escarpment at Lockport as well. Irish immigrants were heavily involved in that section as well. But by and large, the original canal was built by sort of native-born Americans. Um, the construction itself was also it was very dangerous. They had to use black powder in order to blast through these large rock formations. They were digging through and cutting trees and dense forests. There were no trained civil engineers in the United States at the time that the Erie Canal was started. The gentleman who really took charge, people like Benjamin Wright and Canvas White, and others. These guys were surveyors. They were lawyers. They were not trained engineers. They had to themselves go to places like England, to Scotland, to see European canals and how they were built and how they were constructed, and really to self-teach themselves how to do this work. But they brought a lot of knowledge back. They used a lot of trial and error. There were things that were invented in order to help this construction take place. Some things that we take for granted today. I mean, this dibble lift that you see here being used, kind of a forebearer to the modern crane, was used to lift these large stones out of the excavation at Lockport. The forerunner to the current wheelbarrow was created. Hydraulic cement was created in order to patch uh, the walls underwater and to be able to dry. Um, a stump puller that was attached, basically a wheel two wheels on an axle that oxen would be used to pull stumps out of the ground after the trees had been cleared. These are all inventions that were made basically on the fly during the construction of the canal as they came upon these challenges to figure out what the best way in order to accomplish them were. And the other thing that's really interesting about the canal construction is that the contracts were handed out to contractors by the state, sort of by section. So you could have a contract, you would have completely different contractors over a about a 20 to 30 mile stretch of the canal. So coming up on each section of the canal, you could have a contractor who was doing something slightly different uh, than the contractor next to them. And as they were about to converge, there were conversations that had to be had about, about the route wasn't matching up or certain materials that were being used weren't matching, and had to go through those negotiations amongst each other. And then one of the other things that kind of came out of this, and this is one of those areas where I don't think a lot of people realize, a lot of people ask about the use of was the use of slave labor on the canal. Slavery was still legal in New York State up until 1827, so there were still slaves in New York. Um, there's not a great amount of evidence that slaves or enslaved people were used to build the canal. The Erie Canal Museum has some references to people who might have been enslaved, who could have been used as workers on the Erie Canal. But one of the things that's really interesting is that prison labor was used on the canal. Um, so this is a section. This is actually an article from Rochester in 1821. The gentleman who had won the original contract to build the Genesee Aqueduct, the aqueduct that was going to carry the canal over the Genesee River in downtown Rochester, was also the same person who built the state penitentiary in Auburn, New York, as well. And as part of his lobbying effort, he actually lobbied the state legislature to pass a law in 1817 to allow him to use prisoners or convicts from the prison on the construction of the canal. And of course, this didn't go great. So this article itself talks about some of the prisoners who ran away while they were sort of on this duty, and that's largely what happened. I would say I think it was somewhere around 60% of the convicts who were used for this purpose did end up running away, despite the fact that you know there were there were supposedly protections in the laws that were passed in order to allow this from happening. Good thing for the canal construction. Well, I shouldn't say it that way, but um, eventually that contractor passed away, and the contract was awarded to somebody else, and they sort of moved away from using prison labor as part of the workers for the construction of the canal. What did the canal construction look like upon completion? It looked like this. So as you can see on this map, the Hudson River at Albany, way down here in elevation, Lake Erie at Buffalo, 560 feet, 564 feet higher in elevation. During the construction, when they broke ground on July 4th. 1817 in Rome, New York. And they did that on purpose. Because of this area here that you see here called the Montezuma level, it's oftentimes also called the long level, is because it's essentially 70, 75 miles of relatively flat land. And then even going up here to the Utica level, there is sort of this small rise here, but then once again, once you get around Utica, it's really flat. So what they did when they were building and eventually completed the canal, they started in Rome and they started building out both east and west. So the canal was sort of being built going from the center out as opposed to east to west or west to east. The idea was they were going to get the flat the what they consider the easy portions to be done first and deal with the harder sections. Those would be the ones particularly around the Niagara Escarpment at Lockport and then eventually around Cohoes Falls to be the last sections of the canal. And the canal opened as sections opened, they began operating for business. So as sections from Rome to Utica opened, or Rome to Syracuse, or Syracuse to Rochester, boats began using those sections of the canal almost immediately. So by 1823, the canal was fully open from Rochester to Albany. And then it took the last 2 years to get the canal from Rochester to Buffalo and be fully completed. When it was completed, there was a massive ceremony called the Wedding of the Waters, which included Governor DeWitt Clinton, who we see standing on top of the Erie Canal boat Seneca Chief, holding a casket of Lake Erie water, and he embarked on this roughly 10-day or so travel from Buffalo to New York City, where he completed the ceremony known as the Wedding of the Waters, where he poured that casket of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean, symbolizing this all-water connection that was going to transform not only the state but also the nation. And that's exactly what it does. The impacts of the Erie Canal are great. I'm not going to run through all of these, but I do have some slides to get into them a little bit more in depth. But the engineering and technological achievement of the Erie Canal can't really be understated. Like I said, there had been no trained civil engineers in the United States up until this point. Shortly, really during the construction of the canal, and then right afterwards, the formation of the Rensselaer School in Troy, which is now Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, becomes the first engineering school in the United States, and that school is largely founded by people who were involved in the Erie Canal and would go on to sort of use the Erie Canal as its first quote unquote classroom of or school of engineering. We'll talk a little bit more about the lowered shipping costs and the decreased time to travel and the cities across New York. But the transformation of New York City, again, today, I think a lot of people think of the Erie Canal as being something that's unique to upstate New York. We kind of take this idea of New York City being the largest city in the United States, the largest seaport in the United States, almost for granted. At the time that the Erie Canal is completed, it's the fourth largest seaport in the United States. It is uh, it is dwarfed, and dwarfed right isn't the right word, but it's below New Orleans, it's below Baltimore, it's below Philadelphia, and at times it's below Boston as well. So it really is the ability to get goods from the center of the continent to the Hudson River and then to New York City that really transforms New York City within those first couple of decades after the canal system opens into the principal city of the United States. And without that connection east to west from sort of the Great Lakes area into the eastern section of the country, those products that eventually are transfer are transported from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, those areas, Kentucky even, um, would have gone down the Mississippi River. The easiest way to transport that grain from Illinois would have been to send it down the Mississippi River to New Orleans and then out the Gulf and around Florida. And that would have been the easiest way to transport it. So that connection would have been more north-south than it ends up being east and west, which we'll see in just a second. Um, and then a lot of things around like working conditions. The Erie Canal, building it was not pleasant. Being a worker on it was not necessarily pleasant. It was well known for being difficult work, for being long hours, working in difficult conditions. So just sort of thinking about the conditions that these people were working in, both on the construction and in sort of the business of operating the canal, It's something that oftentimes kind of gets overlooked in some of the more, I'll call them glamorous impacts of the canal that we're going to talk about in just a second. His Rochester historian Blake McKelvey gave the Erie Canal this nickname, the Mother of Cities, largely around this idea of the canal brought in this huge population boom. These cities, and you could do this with almost any city across upstate New York, and look at this growth. I picked out these four particularly because I think they give a couple of interesting juxtapositions. Albany, of course, on here is the oldest city of these four. It was an established city by the time the canal system takes is built. But even up until that point, it was only a city of about 12,000, 12 and a half thousand people. Within the first 3 decades of having the canal, as it being the eastern terminus of the canal system, that population explodes from just over 12,000 to almost 51,000. So even in a well-established city, that growth is huge, let alone to talk about the cities that were less well established. Rochester is Rochester's sort of the poster child for this. It was known as the Young Lion of the West because of how fast it grew from a small village of about 1,500 people. Within the first 3 decades, it grows to 36,000 people. That's a percent increase of almost 2,500%. That's 2,500% growth in that city. And Buffalo, again, transforms from a relatively small village along Lake Erie to a bustling city in the grain capital of the world at over 42,000 people within the first 3 decades. So this population growth is huge. You can look at it in almost any community that the canal passed through. It might not be at these great lengths, but for example, places like Seneca Falls. And Seneca Falls in 1820 was only a village of about 1,000 people, 1,500 people maybe by that point, and it grows to be about 8, 9,000 within those first 3 decades. So you see that growth happening almost all over the state, regardless of like how big that growth is. It happens throughout the state. Sort of the economic impact, you see that in sort of the cost of shipping. Travel time is reduced across the state almost by more than half. It would take roughly about 2 weeks pre-canal to travel by a mix of water and land to get from Albany to Buffalo. With the canal system in place, that's reduced to about 6 days. You could probably do it even a little bit faster if you were in one of the really fast packets that got preferential treatment at the locks and things like that. But again, that movement of people makes things more efficient. It makes it easier to transport goods, and the cost of shipping a ton of goods from Buffalo to Albany went down 90% from about $100 per ton down to about $10 per ton in those 30 years. So that that difference is almost immediate. I mean that change, that 90% drop happens almost like overnight, that drop happens. And so these businesses are able to just sort of rake in money. People are able to move much faster. You have goods shipped, like these barrels of apples coming out of Medina, New York, that are just being transported at record speeds at this point. And while we're talking a lot about the Erie Canal, I always do want to make sure, I know, the Champlain is much closer to probably where many of you live today. The Champlain sees this sort of economic boom as well. So I pulled this sheet here. This is from 1846. It's from the report of the Canal Commissioners. Every year, the Canal Commissioners were required to submit a report about activity along all of the New York State canals, or at least the state-owned canals at that time, to show like what was happening in canal communities, what kinds of goods were being shipped, and largely in the North Country, those goods being shipped along the Champlain Canal are what they would call, products of the forest. That's usually the term that they used. They also tracked these for agricultural products, for manufacturers as well. And this just gives you an idea of the tonnage that was being shipped of lumber. Being coming out of the three offices along the Champlain Canal in Whitehall, Schuylerville, and Waterford. Right there, boards and scantling coming out of Whitehall in the year 1846. You have over 119,000 tons of boards and scantling being shipped out of Whitehall at that time. You have 7,107 tons of timber coming out. Schuylerville is shipping 13,723 tons of wood coming out of that office as well. So you have these huge influxes of agricultural products, particularly coming out of the north, coming out of the west, that are really leading to the economic growth of those regions. And people were just obsessed with building canals after the success of the Erie. So another thing that I always like to point out to people is we have four canals that are still in operation. In the heyday in the middle of the 19th century, there were somewhere around a dozen canals operating in New York State, both state-owned, feeder canals and privately owned canals as well. On this map right here, which is somewhere around 1860, I don't exactly remember the date of this map. Railroads are on here as well. So this is a map of the state of New York showing canals and railroads. You have the Champlain up here, the Glens Fall feeder canal here, the Erie running east to west across the state, the Oswego, the Cayuga Seneca, which are the four that are still in operation today. But what people don't also realize is there was the Black River Canal that kind of ran north-south right up here, largely again in order to get access to timber to lumber in the North Country as well. The Shenango Canal, which ran down this way into the southern tier, down to Binghamton. The Crooked Lake Canal, which connected Seneca Lake to Crooked Lake, which is today Keuka Lake. The Genesee Valley Canal running from Rochester down to what is essentially, past kind of or down by Allegheny State Park in the southern tier today. The Chemung Canal, the D&H Canal over here, which is a private venture, which is mainly meant to get Pennsylvania coal up into the Hudson River down to New York City. Same thing with the Chemung Canal. That's largely in order to get Pennsylvania coal up into Seneca Lake and eventually into the Erie Canal system and out through the East Coast as well. So this sort of canal boom, it's not unique to New York State, but for when I talk to a lot of people who are today not necessarily living by a canal, don't necessarily recognize the canal history that they may have in their region of the state or in their communities, this is kind of what I point to is that the Erie was so successful that people were just like, we need to build more canals everywhere. And that happens in the country too. So this map, again, this is a map from 1820, from 1850, somewhere in that range, which shows all of the canals that had been built following the Erie Canal and all of the different trade routes that were built as well. So all of these green lines, these dark green lines, these are all canals that were built during the 18th century. So you see, this web of green connecting across New York State into the Great Lakes, down Western Pennsylvania, across into Ohio, down into, down through Ohio, the western end of Lake Erie, down into Indiana, into Illinois. So connecting these huge pieces, which really does make a cultural connection, again, between the Northeast and the Midwest. And there's a big reason why if you travel out into the Midwest today, a lot of those cities, those towns almost have New England feels to them. And that's because hundreds of thousands of New Englanders and immigrants traveling through the Northeast United States traveled these routes to settle in that area. And they brought those cultural connections with them that were really important and sort of made that east-west cultural connection as opposed to if the canal systems hadn't been there, those folks who would have settled in those regions, again, they would have been sending their goods south to the down the Mississippi. And what would that have looked like if that cultural connection had been north-south as opposed to east and west, especially once we got to the Civil War? Of course, this canal boom does also have a great impact on the indigenous people of New York State and of the Midwest. So, you know, by the time that the canal is being constructed in 1817, this map is reflecting essentially Haudenosaunee and Mohican and Lenni Lenape territories as they were in about 1722. The canal obviously runs directly through what were the ancestral homelands of the Mohican Nation and five of the six Haudenosaunee nations down to Buffalo as well. But this demand, this interest in building the canal did put a lot of pressure on indigenous people in order to gain access for the state of these lands out west that New Yorkers knew would be incredibly valuable. And the more individuals moved on to these lands, the more pressure for indigenous people to sell their lands so that these canals could eventually be constructed and connect to these parts of the state. And even, I think probably the biggest piece, at least to me, is that, as sort of dispossession is happening, uh, the sort of center of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had moved to Buffalo, had moved to Buffalo Creek, the Buffalo Creek Reservation, which was still in operation and was still there in 1826, when the first Treaty of Buffalo Creek was signed. So the idea that more people are moving into Buffalo and that they had to they had to essentially extinguish that native claim to that land in order for the city to grow was still real. So that dispossession does happen during this time period. And again, as more people are moving west, those native people in the Midwest are feeling that pressure as well. There's Indian wars, native wars that are happening in the Ohio country during this period as well. So there are a lot of effects on indigenous people from the building of the canal system. The Underground Railroad is another piece that, again, it's not the canal is not solely responsible for the Underground Railroad, but it definitely plays a big part in its story. This map shows sort of all of the sort of known routes of the Underground Railroad through New York State. I've highlighted a few here, sort of using these arrows because they're some of the ones that were most known to utilize the Erie Canal system, the New York State Canal system, largely from enslaved people who were escaping, coming up the Hudson Valley to Albany, where they would then either be forwarded up the Champlain Canal and continue on up into Canada that way, or they could be forwarded west along the Erie Canal, either hopping off in Syracuse to go north to the Oswego Canal and across Lake Ontario, or continue west to Buffalo, to Niagara Falls, or to Black Rock, and to cross over into Canada that way as well. And, Frederick Douglass, in his third autobiography, when he discusses the routes that he used on the Underground Railroad, he specifically calls out that the branch of the Underground Railroad that he utilized the most was the branch that came up the Hudson Valley from Baltimore, Wilmington, and Philadelphia, and New York to Albany. Where enslaved people would then be, freedom seekers would then be forwarded on to Syracuse, Rochester, and eventually cross the border into St. Catharines, into freedom here in Canada. And there really, I don't think, is much of a shock that when you look at where notable abolitionists lived. And again, I am just sort of pulling out a few examples of the ones many of us are probably familiar with, including Stephen Myers, Harriet, and his wife Harriet in Albany, Jermaine Logan in Syracuse, Harriet Tubman in Auburn, Frederick Douglass in Rochester, and William Wells Brown in Buffalo. That these folks found sort of fertile ground for this abolitionist spirit across upstate New York, across the Erie Canal corridor. And it's really not, when you look at the records, it's really not a shock why they would settle in these regions and why they would see the canal system and these routes as being the ones that are the most efficient for getting freedom seekers from slavery to freedom in Canada. And that really goes kind of the same thing with the women's rights movement. Again, I think there's elements of I can't say I've studied this historically speaking. It's really kind of more of conjecture on my part, but thinking of those hundreds of thousands of New Englanders who moved into what would eventually become upstate New York, particularly central and western New York, when you think and when you kind of look at who they were, many of them were people who had kind of been pushed out of sort of the older established systems of New England. So these are probably people who are younger. They probably have a little bit more of that fire burning in them, uh, of wanting to prove themselves, of wanting to sort of stick it to the older establishment in some way. So it's not shocking to me that, abolitionism would really gain hold in this area where these folks established themselves, and also things like women's rights. So I think most of us know that the first Women's Rights Convention, which is being depicted in this image here, takes place in Seneca Falls, a canal community in 1848. And from there, much of the early women's rights movement is really focused on New York State. Eventually, when women's rights leaders get around to starting to hold national women's rights conventions. A lot of those are happening in places like Syracuse. They're happening in places like Rochester. These individuals living in these canal communities. Susan B. Anthony in Rochester, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, born in Johnstown, New York, lives a good portion in Seneca Falls before moving to Boston. Matilda Jocelyn Gage living in Fayetteville, New York. These are really your early women's rights leaders. They're coming out of these canal communities. They're using the canal to spread their message. They're hosting most of their early meetings in canal communities before they start branching off into cities like New York, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Boston, and others. So there's just something there that's kind of burning underneath that the canal has a major impact in. And even as you get into later periods of the women's rights movement, so this article here is talking about a canal a suffrage canal boat journey, which is going to take place in 1908 to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention. It's sort of organized and operated by Harriet Stanton Blatch, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter. So even going into sort of the later periods of the suffrage movement, when it has moved away sort of from upstate New York and really does focus on some of the larger urban areas, or has moved out sort of west as well, this idea of connecting the lineage of the women's rights movement to the canal still comes back and still has this sort of idea of this parade that would take people from Seneca Falls, following along the canal, stopping at canal communities, giving speeches, displaying banners before they eventually make their way down the Hudson River to New York City, too. And sort of the last, maybe not last, but the last one that I kind of focus on in terms of like social movements that's largely spread along the canal is the Second Great Awakening, the area that would become known as the Burned Over District, because of this religious revival, this spirit of sort of being encompassed by uh, you know, being moved by sort of the Holy Spirit to these large revivals that take place. Some of the most famous being the minister Charles Finney's revivals that he holds in Rochester over the summer of or over 1830 to 1831. And sort of these revivals, they happen all over upstate New York. Uh, People are just sort of overtaken by the spirit of this connection to God. This is when you see the formation of the Mormons in Palmyra, New York. You see settlement of the Oneida community, out by Rome. The Shakers find, places to live around, the canal communities as well. So you really have a lot of these sort of religious revivals that are happening that again, I think there's more there, thinking about what the canal meant for how it was changing society, how it was able to spread news and move people faster than ever before. That really just brought a whole host of cultural changes into the United States. Or if it didn't bring them in, it certainly accelerated them. So what happened? Railroads happened. So, when railroads start gaining steam, sorry for the pun there, in the 1840s and certainly by the 1850s, railroads are siphoning off business from canals by that time, by the 1850s. By about 1850, 1855, most passenger traffic had ceased to exist on the canal. Packet boats that typically would have run people between Albany and Buffalo really were not operating anymore. Commercial shipments were certainly still flourishing. The largest number of boats that went through the canal was in 1855. The peak tonnage for the canal was in 1880. But in by that time, after that, the railroads really start siphoning off most of that business. New York State abolishes canal tolls as an attempt to kind of push more business on the canals, but it still keeps dipping. 1899, Theodore Roosevelt establishes the Advisory Committee on Canals, which does recommend the building of the New York State Barge Canal. Uh, that act is passed in 1903. Happened, as we said before, it's completed in 1918. And again, once that kind of happens, there is sort of a revitalization of New York State's canal system. They are once again kind of more economic and industrial engines by that point. But in 1959, what most people see is kind of the death knell for the canal system is the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway, because the St. Lawrence Seaway essentially allows large ocean liners, tankers to get directly in from the ocean through the Seaway directly into Lake Ontario, from Lake Ontario to the Welland Canal to Lake Erie, and bypassing the New York State Canal System. So at that point, the larger dimensions, the larger locks, they're able to go right in, and that's really seen as sort of the final nail in the coffin for the New York State Canal System, kind of as an economic, um, commercial operation. Today, New York's canal systems, they are still in operation. They are the oldest continually operated human-made waterway in North America. Maybe one of the longest titles you can possibly have, but they are still in operation. They are largely for used for recreational purposes today. I think it's somewhere around 75, 80% of the lockings that take place on the canal system today are recreational boats, are paddlers, kayakers, canoers, paddle boats, those types of things that are going through the system purely for recreational purposes. There is a large heritage tourism industry across upstate New York utilizing the heritage of the canal system, canal communities, connections to a lot of those historical movements that we talked about today. And uh, while it's not its principal use anymore, there are still commercial shippings that do go along the canal system. They are things that are too large to go either by road, by rail, or by airplane. But there has been some notable examples over the last several years. This particular picture is the bridge that is going to be installed at the new Ralph C. Wilson Park in Buffalo. That's opening next year in 2026, which was transported from a manufacturer in Italy to Buffalo to the park last year. Genesee Brewing in Rochester has shipped large brewing containers along the canal. The U.S. Navy has shipped sonar equipment along the canal. GE has shipped large turbines and other equipment across the canal as well. So while it's not its primary use anymore, it still does serve a commercial shipping purpose today. And so I know we're at our hour now, and I certainly I want to thank everybody for spending the time with us tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have. I know I covered kind of a lot of information on there. This is the obviously the bicentennial year of the Erie Canal. So I do encourage you, if you are, doing any traveling along upstate New York, on our website, eriecanalway.org, we have a calendar of events. Uh, Many of them are bicentennial related events that are going on across the state. So I certainly encourage you to utilize that events calendar and get out and attend some of the festivals, attend some lectures at other museums or other places that might be happening as well. And just to get out and enjoy this sort of seminal year, because it's going to be a really big one, and really important to us and to the state and to the nation. So with that, I will stop and I will take any questions that might have come in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. We do have a few questions already in. Just a reminder to everyone else, if you do have a question, feel free to type it in the chat and I will read it aloud. So our first question comes from Eric, and they ask, what is the best way to explore the Erie Canal?
Well, I think that depends on your interests and your location and your particular abilities too. Um, I think sort of on the uh, I think for a lot of people it is on a tour boat. So there are tour boats that operate in various sections of the canal. I think that's a great way to sort of do it, at a leisurely pace, and to have sort of somebody who's able to kind of guide you and provide some, interpretive information, educational information as you go. So places like Erie Canal Cruises that operate out of Herkimer, or the Colonial Bell out of Rochester, Lockport, Erie Canal Cruises. Those are great ways to do it. I personally, I like kayaking on the canal. I think it's, especially out here. I live in the western section, so I live in Rochester. Um, it's a very, it's very calm. There's not, you can't go very, boats can't go very fast on the canal. They can only go about 10 miles an hour. So, if you are somebody who enjoys, paddle boating, paddle boarding, kayaking, canoeing, that kind of thing, I think that's a great way to be able to explore the canal. But I don't know that there's any wrong way to do it. Just probably not, don't swim in it.
All right. Well, William asks, is water taken from the Mohawk River to get over that Utica hump?
So today the yes. So today the Mohawk River and the Erie Canal are one and the same. There's a canalized channel in the Mohawk River today. So yes, the flow of water comes directly from the Mohawk River to feed that section that kind of goes in, yes, that goes into the Utica hump, as you say.
Okay. Harry comments, thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you, Harry. Sue said, really interesting presentation. Thank you. A thank you from Kim. And then Bob asks, whoop, can we get your slides? I cannot write that fast.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'd be happy to send them over to Rebecca and she can
Sure,
send them out to the contact list, if that's what you would like. Yeah. No problem with that.
absolutely. Bob, just for reference, my email address is educator@chapmanmuseum.org. So if you want to shoot me an email, once I have the slides, I can send them to you. Kim says, thank you, Patrick. Very informative and entertaining.
Yep.
And then Kevin mentions, don't forget to mention the bike path. Thank you for your presentation.
Yes, the bike path. Yes, so the Canalway Trail, the Empire State Trail, that is a great way to go along the canal. And the Canalway Trail in many places follows the original towpath. So you're kind of following in the footsteps of the mules and horses that would have been towing the boats along the canal system. Yes.
Very nice. Nice. And Joanne says, thanks. I loved it. Very good. All right. Well, I'll pause for just a second, see if there's any. Oh, one more question came in. Can you recommend some books or documentaries about the canal?
Y yes. Let's see. Um, oh gosh. The challenge is always remembering exactly what they're called. Uh, there's uh, there's the Wedding of the Waters is a really good book. Um, let's see. Erie Water West is another good one. A good book. There's The Artificial River, which is also another really good book. Documentaries. I will say I'm probably not as familiar with a lot of the documentaries that are out there. I know WMHT, the PBS affiliate uh, in Albany is working on a documentary that they are releasing short segments of currently, and will be releasing the full hour-long documentary in September. So, I think that would be a great one to keep an eye out for. But yeah, I think those are some of the good ones.
Awesome. And since I don't want to exclude anyone who might not be able to type fast, if you want to unmute yourself to ask your question, feel free to do that as well. All right. So I guess that is it.
Hey, well, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, guys, thank you for joining us tonight. Make sure you check back next month. We're going to have another Conversations with the Past lecture. And oh, Bob just commented, I suggest The Great Ditch, which describes the development, the canal, and the Second Great Awakening. Cool.
It's a great one. Good.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank
Excellent.
you.
All right. Very good. All right. So once again, thank you for joining us tonight, guys. Make sure you check on those social media pages for the Chapman, and you'll see next month's schedule for all of our programs and presentations. And thank you again, Patrick, for a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for attending tonight.
All right. Have a nice night, everyone.